no money, no party. My younger brother, David, didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. He was leaning against the marble countertop of our late mother's kitchen, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon that he hadn't paid for. We were supposed to be discussing the final arrangements for the estate sale, a somber task that required dignity and cooperation. Instead, David was treating it like a hostile takeover. I had suggested we keep a few of Mom's antique quilts to pass down to the nieces, mentioning that they held more sentimental value than cash. He laughed, a sharp, metallic sound that echoed off the cabinets. Sentimental value doesn't pay the country club dues, Margaret. You've always been soft, living in that little rent-controlled bubble of yours. If you want a seat at the table where real decisions are made, you need capital. Since you don't have any, stay in your lane. Pensions don't buy power, Margaret. He walked away, leaving me standing in the silence of the home where I had spent 30 years caring for our parents while he was off building his empire in the city. The humiliation wasn't just private. 2 hours later, at the family dinner at the local bistro, David decided to make my financial status the evening's entertainment. In front of our cousins, our childhood friends, and even my own daughter, he made a grand show of paying the entire bill. When I reached for my purse to contribute my share, he put his hand over mine, not out of kindness, but to pin it to the table. "Put that away, Margaret," he said, loud enough for the neighboring table to turn their heads. "We all know your pension barely covers your knitting supplies. It's my treat. Consider it a donation to the sisterhood of the perpetually broke." The table went quiet. My daughter's face flushed with anger, her eyes darting to mine, waiting for me to snap. But I didn't. I have spent a lifetime being the reliable sister, the one who stayed behind, the one who didn't complain, the one who was easily underestimated because I didn't wear my net worth on my wrist. David had mistaken my silence for weakness and my frugality for failure. He saw my modest home and my lack of designer labels as proof that I was a second-class citizen in our family. He spent the rest of the night boasting about his new Tesla, his unrivaled portfolio, and his plan to liquidate our mother's estate to fund a new venture. He spoke to me as if I were a child, explaining the basics of inflation as if I hadn't audited municipal accounts for 3 decades. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him that while he was chasing trends, I was quietly building a legacy of my own. I just watched him. I noticed the way he avoided eye contact when his phone buzzed with a private number call. I saw the slight sweat on his brow despite the air conditioning. He was so busy mocking my lack of money that he didn't realize I was the one holding all the cards he didn't even know were in the deck. As I drove home in my reliable, paid-off SUV, I felt a strange, cold calm. The realization hit me then: David wasn't just being a bully, he was desperate. And for a man who believed empty pockets meant empty voice, he had no idea how quickly the music was about to stop. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to observe. The Monday morning after the party, the humiliation didn't just linger. It went viral within our social circle. I woke up to a notification from the family's private Facebook group, a digital town square where our entire extended family, from my aunts in Florida to my cousins in Oregon, gathers to share news. David had posted a photo of me standing by the buffet at the retirement party. I looked tired, my hand reaching for a slider, while he stood in the background, perfectly lit, holding a glass of vintage scotch. The caption was a direct hit. Some people spend their lives saving for a rainy day and forget to notice they're already underwater. I tried to invite Margaret to the VIP lounge, but as I told her, success has a price she simply cannot pay. It's sad when you have to choose between a steak and a utility bill at 68. He didn't stop there. He tagged our younger cousins, the ones just starting their careers, telling them to look at Margaret if you want to see what happens when you lack vision. It wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a public character assassination. He was using my privacy and my quiet lifestyle as proof of my failure, framing my financial discipline as desperate poverty. I sat at my kitchen table, my phone trembling in my hand. My daughter, Sarah, watched me from across the island. She's a woman of few words, but she sees everything. She saw the way David had been eyeing our mother's estate papers during the last holiday. She saw the way he'd been subtly asking about my pension. His overplaying his hand. "Mom," she said softly. "People who are truly wealthy don't need to post about it at 6 a.m. on a Monday." Her words anchored me. I scrolled through the comments. Our Aunt Martha had replied, "David, that seems a bit harsh," to which David responded, "Honesty is the best policy, Auntie. Someone has to be the successful one in this family. If Margaret's offended, She can pay for the next dinner. Oh, wait, she can't. The cruelty was calculated. He was building a narrative that I was a burden, a woman with empty pockets who didn't deserve a seat at the table. He wanted the family to see me as the pauper sister so that no one would ever question his position as the patriarch of our mother's remaining estate. But then, I saw the slip-up. In his haste to brag, David had posted a second photo, a screenshot of his investment portfolio to show off his gains. He meant to show the big numbers at the bottom, but he hadn't cropped it properly. In the corner of the screen, a notification tab was visible. It was a red alert from a high-interest payday loan service. My heart skipped a beat. A man who claims to be a multimillionaire does not have notifications from predatory lenders. I took a screenshot of his screenshot and zoomed in. The date on the alert was current. The amount owed was staggering. It was the first crack in the porcelain. He was mocking me for having no money while he was drowning in debt he couldn't service. He wasn't just being a bully, he was projecting. He was terrified that the party was about to end, and he was using me as a distraction. I didn't comment on the post. I didn't argue. I simply saved the image to a private folder. I felt a cold, quiet resolve. If David wanted to play a game of liquidity and leverage, we would play. But we would play by my rules, and the final score would be settled in public. It was 3 a.m. when I found myself back on David's profile, the blue light of my tablet the only glow in my dark living room. I am not a person who dwells on insults, but as a retired auditor, I have a biological inability to ignore numbers that don't add up. David's public mockery had been loud, but his digital footprint was starting to whisper a different story. I began scrolling past the no money, no party post, moving deeper into his timeline from the last 6 months. On the surface, it was a highlight reel of a high roller, expensive dinners, a new luxury SUV, and constant mentions of closed deals and equity shifts. But when you look at the world through the lens of a balance sheet, you stop seeing the sparkle and start seeing the friction. I noticed a post from June 12 where he bragged about a massive weekend in Vegas at a 5-star suite. Yet, 3 days later, on June 15, he had shared a blurry photo of his favorite local diner, complaining that the town's infrastructure was failing. I zoomed in on the background of that diner photo. In the reflection of a window, I saw his SUV. It wasn't the new model he'd been flaunting. It was his old, dented sedan with a temporary spare tire on the rear driver's side. The timeline was full of these little fractures. On July 20th, he posted a throwback Thursday of a beach in the Maldives, implying he was currently there, but the weather app icon in the corner of his own screenshot showed a temperature of 52 degrees and heavy rain, the exact forecast for our hometown that day. Why would a man with limitless assets spend so much energy faking a life he already claimed to have? I went back to the screenshot I took of his portfolio slip-up. The payday loan alert was dated the 14th. That was the same day he had called me to generously offer to buy my share of Mom's house for 40 cents on the dollar, claiming he wanted to take the burden off my hands. He wasn't trying to help me. He was looking for a quick liquidation to cover a high-interest debt. He was using our mother's legacy as a gambling chip to stay afloat. Every post he made mocking my simple life was a smokescreen. He needed the family to believe I was the broke one so that if he ever asked for an advance on the inheritance, it would look like an act of business rather than an act of desperation. I opened a spreadsheet on my laptop and began cross-referencing his public claims with the reality I was seeing. Date: August 5th. Claim: bought a vintage Rolex today. Reality: a photo he posted of his wrist 2 days later showed a watch where the second hand was stuttering, a classic sign of a cheap battery-operated replica, not a mechanical masterpiece. Date: September 1st. Claim: new office expansion. Reality: the address on the lease agreement he flashed for 2 seconds in a video was actually for a co-working space that offered virtual addresses for $90 a month. The deeper I dug, the more the golden boy began to look like a man standing on a melting ice floe. He had built a fortress of lies, and he was using the phrase no money, no party as the gatekeeper to keep anyone from getting close enough to see the cracks. I sat back, the clock chiming 4, and felt a cold shiver. Something was fundamentally wrong with my brother's world. He wasn't just being mean, he was being dangerous. He was playing a game of chicken with the truth, and I realized he was heading straight for a wall. The following week, I became a ghost on David's timeline. I didn't like his status updates, and I didn't comment on his flashy photos of steak dinners and champagne toasts. I simply watched as the pattern solidified into a predictable cycle of deception. David was posting with an almost manic frequency now, as if he were trying to drown out the quiet reality of his situation with a flood of digital noise. He posted a photo of a luxury car steering wheel with the caption, "Upgrade Day. If you aren't moving forward, you're moving backward. Sorry, Margaret, no room in the back for your coupons." It was another public dig, another attempt to reinforce the no money, no party narrative. But I looked at the reflection in the polished chrome of the dashboard. I saw the distinct blue and white sign of a rent-a-car return lane in the background. He hadn't bought a new car. He had rented one for a few hours just to take a photo that would make me look small and him look significant. I sat in my study, surrounded by my own records, meticulous, boring, and absolutely honest. It was a stark contrast to the theater David was performing. I realized that my brother had forgotten the first rule of the digital age. Once you put a lie on the internet, it becomes a permanent record that waits patiently for someone to find the contradiction. A digital footprint isn't just a trail of where you've been, it's a time-stamped ledger that never sleeps, and when public lies are etched into social media, they age like milk in the sun, souring as soon as the real world catches up to the digital one. He was documenting his own downfall, frame by frame, thinking he was showing off his glory when he was actually providing me with a roadmap of his desperation. I started a physical file, printing out his posts and cross-referencing them with the local property tax records I could access through my country auditor's database. The contradictions were everywhere. He claimed to have closed a 7-figure real estate deal in our downtown district, but the public records showed the building in question had been sold to a holding company out of Delaware, one that was currently being sued for non-payment of utility bills. David's name wasn't on the deed, it was on the list of persons of interest for a secondary lien. He was acting like the owner when he was likely just a middleman who hadn't been paid his commission. I felt a pang of something that wasn't quite pity, but a profound sense of exhaustion. He was working so hard to maintain a facade of wealth that he was actually spending more than he earned just to keep the lie alive. He was mocking my broke life while I sat on a nest egg he couldn't even imagine, all because he couldn't stand the idea of being seen as ordinary. I watched his latest video, where he was laughing about people who wait for a pension, and I saw the way his eyes darted to the side when a door opened off camera. He looked hunted. He was waiting for the party to be crashed, and I realized I was the only one who saw the flashing lights in the distance. The family home sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, a sturdy brick colonial that our father had paid off with 30 years of sweat and overtime. To David, it was just the property, 4 walls and a roof that represented a specific dollar amount in his dwindling ledger. To me, it was a sanctuary of memory. I could still see the faint indentations in the hardwood floors where Mom had moved her sewing machine every spring to catch the afternoon light. I could smell the faint, lingering scent of Father's pipe tobacco in the wood paneling of the den. When David stood in the center of the living room, his expensive loafers clicking sharply against the floor, he didn't see a legacy, he saw an exit strategy. He kept pacing the perimeter, eyeing the moldings and the vintage fixtures not with nostalgia, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a liquidator. "We need to move fast, Margaret," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "The market is peaking. We sell now, as is, to a developer I know. No inspections, no delays. I've already drafted the intent to sell." I watched him from the doorway, my hand resting on the smooth banister I had slid down as a child. I remembered the day our father had painted that banister, his hands calloused and steady, telling us that a home was the only true anchor a person could have in a storm. David was trying to cut the anchor. He was pushing for a quick sale that would undervalue the house by at least 30%, all for the sake of speed. I noticed he wouldn't look at the framed family photos still sitting on the mantel. He was avoiding the eyes of the people who had built this life for us. "Why the rush, David?" I asked, keeping my voice low and steady. "Mom only passed 6 months ago. We agreed to take a year to sort through her things. The market isn't going anywhere." He snapped his head toward me, a flash of genuine anger crossing his face before he masked it with that practiced, condescending smirk. "Margaret, this is why you'll always be comfortable instead of successful. You trade opportunity for sentiment. I'm trying to make sure we both get a payout that actually matters." He didn't realize that I had already seen the warning signs. I had noticed the urgent notice from the county tax assessor tucked under a pile of junk mail on the kitchen counter, addressed to David, regarding a different property he claimed to own outright. I had seen the way he winced when his phone buzzed, a sound that now seemed to haunt him like a ticking clock. The tension in the house was thick, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. He was desperate for the cash from this house to plug the holes in his own sinking ship. He was willing to sell our parents' history to save his own future, all while mocking me for being too poor to understand the big picture. As I stood there, I realized that the house was no longer a place of peace. It had become a battlefield. David wasn't just my brother anymore. He was a predator trying to harvest the last of our family's stability. I looked at the spot on the wall where our growth heights were still marked in pencil. I wasn't going to let him tear it down. The tension between us was a wire pulled to the breaking point, and I knew that if I didn't act soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. The oak door to Mr. Henderson's office closed with a solid, reassuring thud. I had known Arthur Henderson for 20 years. He was the kind of man who still used a fountain pen and believed that a person's word was only as good as the paper it was printed on. I sat across from him, my hands folded neatly in my lap, while he adjusted his spectacles and began to pull the estate files. I hadn't told David I was coming here. In his world, I was too busy reconciling ledgers to understand the complexities of probate law. But I knew something he had forgotten. I was the co-executor of our mother's will. David had been acting as if my signature was a mere formality he could bypass with enough bluster and mockery. As Arthur spread the documents across the desk, the silence in the room became heavy with the weight of cold, hard facts. "Margaret," he said softly, his brow furrowed, "I've been looking into the preliminary filings David submitted last week. There are irregularities." He turned a document toward me. It was an application for a bridge loan against the family home, listing the estate as collateral. David had signed his name with a flourish, but in the space where my signature was required, there was a strange, jagged mark that looked nothing like my handwriting. He hadn't just overstepped, he had crossed a line that leads directly to a courtroom. He was so convinced that I was a passive, penniless bystander that he thought I wouldn't bother to check the public record until it was too late. He assumed that because I stayed silent while he lectured me on net worth, I was giving him permission to dismantle our inheritance. In this life, I've learned that assumption is a dangerous substitute for consent, and titles and legal documents carry a weight that no amount of social media bravado can offset. Silence is never the same thing as permission. He thought my lack of noise meant a lack of awareness, but in the eyes of the law, the only thing that speaks is the ink on the page. Arthur looked at me with a mix of pity and professional concern. His in deep, "Margaret. This loan was meant to be wired to a private account in the city, not the estate's trust. If you hadn't come in today, the house would have been encumbered by the end of the week." I felt a strange sense of detachment. The brother I had shared holidays with, the boy I had protected on the playground, had disappeared, replaced by a man who saw his own sister as an obstacle to be defrauded. The authority of the law was now standing between David and his desperation. I realized that my quiet life hadn't been a weakness, it had been my greatest shield. Because I didn't need the money, I wasn't blinded by the same greed that was currently devouring him. I asked Arthur to prepare a formal freeze on all estate assets and to draft a letter of inquiry regarding the forged signature. I didn't want a scene, and I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted a paper trail so thick that David couldn't lie his way out of it. As I left the office, I felt the first real shift in the power balance. The law doesn't care about VIP lounges or standard of living. It only cares about the truth. And for the first time in years, the truth was firmly on my side. His obsession with the net worth mantra reached its fever pitch on a humid Tuesday morning. I pulled into the driveway of our childhood home to find a sleek black sedan already parked there. Two men in expensive, ill-fitting suits were walking the perimeter of the backyard with David. They weren't looking at the garden Mom had tended for 40 years, they were pointing at the roofline and talking about density and lot coverage. David was gesturing wildly, his face flushed with the excitement of a man who thinks he's about to hit a jackpot. When he saw me, he didn't even offer a greeting. He just smirked and checked his watch. "You're late, Margaret. But don't worry, I've handled the heavy lifting. Meet the new owners of the lot. We just shook on a price of $450,000, all cash. We close in 14 days. I've already allocated your half into a managed fund I oversee, so you don't have to worry about managing such a large amount of capital." I stood by the old oak tree, watching him sell our history for less than 60% of its market value. $450,000 was an insult. The land alone was worth more, but David was so desperate for his commission and his share to cover those payday loans that he was practically giving it away. He was vibrating with a frantic energy, desperate to get these men to sign a binder before I could say a word. The buyers looked at me with a sort of bored pity, clearly briefed by David that I was the difficult, simple-minded sister who didn't understand how the world worked. David leaned in close to me, his voice a sharp whisper. "Don't ruin this. This is more money than you've seen in your entire life. Just nod and let the professionals finish the deal. Remember, no money, no party. Today, I'm the host." He actually patted my shoulder as if I were a stray dog he was finally feeding. I remained completely silent. I didn't point out that the binder they were signing was legally worthless without my verified signature as co-executor. I didn't mention that the house was currently under a legal freeze that Mr. Henderson had finalized only an hour ago. I simply watched the transaction take place like a spectator at a play. The anger from our cousins and the neighbors who saw the for sale sign was already boiling over on Facebook, with David replying to every concerned comment with, "Margaret is finally being taken care of. It's time for her to retire from her worries." It was the ultimate betrayal, selling our mother's soul to save his own skin, all while pretending it was an act of charity for me. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied me into a corner where I would be too grateful for the crumbs to notice he'd stolen the loaf. I looked at the buyers, then back at my brother's sweating face. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt the cold, hard weight of the trap I had set. The party wasn't starting. The doors were being locked from the outside. The paper trail didn't just tighten, it began to suffocate. While David was busy posting photos of closing celebration dinners he couldn't afford, the gears of the county's legal system were turning with silent, bureaucratic precision. I spent my mornings in the quiet halls of the records office, working with the clerk to document every instance where David had attempted to use the estate's EIN for his personal credit applications. The evidence was overwhelming. He hadn't just forged a signature on a house sale, he had been systematically trying to siphon off the small life insurance policy Mom had left behind. I watched from a distance as the first waves of panic began to hit him. It started with a frantic post on Facebook, "Bureaucracy is the enemy of progress. Some bitter people are trying to stall a legitimate business deal. Stay tuned for the truth." He didn't name me, but he didn't have to. The family was starting to smell the smoke. I received a series of increasingly desperate voicemails from him over the next 48 hours. His voice, once full of that wealth-obsessed bravado, was now strained and thin. "Margaret, call me. There's a misunderstanding at the bank. They're saying the accounts are flagged. I know you're confused about the house sale, but we need that liquidity now. Don't be spiteful, it's beneath you." I didn't return the calls. I sat in my quiet living room, reading a book, while the legal notifications were served to his virtual office in the city. He didn't realize that when you play with fire in a house made of paper lies, the entire structure goes up at once. The sheriff's office had already made a preliminary visit to the buyers, informing them that the property they thought they were purchasing was involved in an estate fraud investigation. The all-cash deal evaporated overnight, leaving David standing in the middle of a desert he had created himself. The most satisfying part of the process was the lack of confrontation. I didn't need to scream at him or tell him I told him so. The documents did the talking. Every time he tried to move a dollar, he hit a wall. Every time he tried to lie to a relative, I sent a PDF of the actual court filing to that relative's inbox. He was being stripped of his finery, piece by piece, by the very boring systems he had mocked me for relying on. I saw him one last time before the formal hearing. He was sitting in his car outside my house, his head in his hands. He looked old. He looked like a man who had finally realized that the party was a hallucination and the money was a debt he could never repay. He didn't come to the door. He knew I wouldn't open it. I wasn't his sister in that moment. I was the auditor of his life's failures, and the audit was finally complete. The consequences weren't coming, they had arrived, and they brought no music with them. The collapse of a reputation is rarely a sudden explosion. It is a series of small, rhythmic cracks that eventually bring the whole structure down. For David, the cracks started on the very platform he had used to humiliate me. It began when our cousin Elena, who has a sharp eye for detail and even less patience for nonsense, noticed that the for sale sign on Mom's lawn had been replaced not by a sold banner, but by a legal notice from the county. She didn't call David privately. Following the example he had set, she posted a photo of the notice directly to the family group. "Hey David," she tagged him, "the guys in the suits left, and this paper says the sale is halted due to unverified authorization. Care to explain?" I thought Margaret was the one who didn't understand money. The thread exploded. It was as if a dam had burst. For years, The family had tolerated David's arrogance because they believed his success was real. Now, they were looking for blood. I watched from the sidelines as David tried to spin the narrative one last time. He typed frantically, his comments filled with typos and desperate excuses. It's a technicality. Margaret is being manipulated by a low-level lawyer. I'm protecting the family assets. But the audience had shifted. One by one, the people he had mocked began to share their own stories. An old family friend posted a screenshot of a hot tip David had given him 2 years ago that had resulted in a 5-figure loss. Another cousin revealed that David had asked her for a short-term bridge loan 6 months ago and had never paid it back. The specific proof hooks I had quietly distributed, the fake office address, the replica watch, the predatory loan alerts, began to circulate through private messages and then into the public comments. The no money, no party line was thrown back in his face with surgical precision. The community he had tried to impress now saw him as a common fraud who had tried to swindle his own sister. The public unraveling was total. David's Facebook profile, once a gallery of manufactured luxury, became a testament to his deceit. Every time he posted a new lie to cover the old ones, someone would respond with a time-stamped contradiction or a link to the public records. He was being dismantled by the very digital footprint he thought he controlled. I saw a comment from Aunt Janine, the matriarch of the family, that simply read, "David, we are ashamed. Leave your sister alone." That was the final blow. In our family, Aunt Janine's disapproval is a social death sentence. David didn't have the VIP lounge to retreat to. He didn't even have the respect of the people who had known him since he was in diapers. His reputation wasn't just damaged, it was liquidated. He had spent his life trying to be the man who owned the room, only to find that he had locked himself out. I didn't have to say a word to the family. The evidence spoke with a voice louder than any argument I could have started. He was finally seeing that while money can buy a party, it cannot buy a seat at a table built on trust. 6 months have passed since the dust settled in the halls of the county courthouse. The air has turned crisp, and the oak trees in my backyard are shedding their leaves in a quiet, golden rain. I sit on my porch with a cup of tea, looking out at a horizon that feels remarkably clear. The house, our parents' house, is still standing. It wasn't sold to developers, and it wasn't liquidated to pay off a stranger's gambling debts. Through a series of legal maneuvers and a fair buyout facilitated by Mr. Henderson, I am now the sole owner of the property. It remains a sanctuary of memory, preserved not out of a desperate need for a payout, but because some things are worth more than the numbers on a ledger. David is gone from this town, and largely gone from the family's daily life. He moved to another state, reportedly to start over, though the rumors suggest he is still chasing the same ghosts of grandeur that led him to the brink of ruin here. I find myself reflecting on the nature of the noise he made. Looking back, his taunts about my low-budget life don't hurt me anymore. They sound like the frantic whistles of a sinking ship. I've realized that the loudest mockery often acts as a decorative veil for the deepest insecurities, a desperate attempt to distract others from the rot beneath the surface. Facts are the only thing with the weight to outlast the noise of a fragile ego, and in the end, the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. David spent so much energy trying to build a stage that he forgot to build a foundation. He thought that by making me feel small, he would somehow feel larger. But as the auditor of my own life, I know that you cannot balance a sheet by stealing from the liabilities column. You have to be honest with the numbers, or the numbers will eventually become your judge. I am emotionally detached from the anger now. When I think of my brother, I don't feel the heat of betrayal or the rush of a win. I feel a profound sense of stillness. I see the photos he still occasionally posts on a new social media account, different city, same filter. His in a rented suit in front of a borrowed backdrop, still trying to convince a new audience that he is the host of a party that never ends. I don't feel the need to expose him there. My work is done. I have secured our parents' legacy, protected my own dignity, and maintained the quiet, disciplined life that David once mocked. I have learned that true wealth isn't about the ability to buy a round of drinks for people who don't care about you. It's the peace of mind that comes from knowing exactly who you are when the lights go out. I look at my garden, well-tended and silent, and I realize that the party David was so worried about was never one I wanted to attend. I have my own celebration here, in the quiet reality of a life built on truth. The final legal papers arrived yesterday, bound in a simple blue folder that carried more weight than any of David's designer luggage. With a single signature, the house, and the narrative of our family, was officially settled. I spent the afternoon walking through the empty rooms of the Colonial, not looking for ghosts, but appreciating the silence. David had called me one last time before the final hearing, his voice lacking its usual edge. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Instead, he asked for a loan to help him with his legal fees, framing it as an investment in our future relationship. I didn't shout. I didn't remind him of the insults or the forged signatures. I simply told him no, and hung up. There was no need for a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation. When the truth is finally laid bare, the theater of the lie simply ceases to matter. I've spent 68 years learning that dignity isn't something you buy. It's something you retain by refusing to engage with those who try to steal it. David's tragedy was believing that a lifestyle was a substitute for a life, and that public perception was a substitute for private character. He is still out there somewhere, running a race on a treadmill, convinced that if he just goes fast enough, he'll finally arrive at the success he's been faking for decades. I am no longer his audience, and I am certainly no longer his safety net. By standing my ground and using the very systems he mocked to hold him accountable, I didn't just save a house, I reclaimed the history of my name. The family group on Facebook has grown quiet now. People have moved on to new photos and different stories, but the atmosphere at our holiday gatherings has changed. There is a new respect in the way my cousins speak to me, a quiet recognition that the pauper sister was actually the one holding the foundation together while the golden boy tried to sell the bricks. I walked out onto the back porch and looked at the garden. The perennials are tucked away for the winter, waiting for a spring that I will be here to see. I realized then that the most powerful thing a person can own isn't a portfolio or a luxury car. It is the absolute ownership of their own peace of mind. David wanted the party, but he forgot that someone always has to pay the band. I didn't win because I have more money than him. I won because I never needed the money to tell me who I was. I locked the front door, the key turning with a familiar, solid click. The air was still, the neighborhood was at peace, and for the first time in years, the account was perfectly balanced. Life has a way of auditing the soul when we least expect it, and I have found that the only currency that truly holds its value is the quiet, unshakable truth of a life lived with integrity.